It's been 225 years since delegates to the Constitutional Convention signed the document that established the government of the United States, the U.S. Constitution. September 17th was Constitution Day. That day, Rose State College explored the impact of one particular branch of government, the judiciary, with a speaker sworn to uphold the Constitution, Oklahoma Supreme Court Justice Noma Gurich. Here's some of what Justice Gurich said in this ONR Extra.
So what you're thinking about here is a system that our founders started, which was in their minds to be three equal branches of government. But it seems like, to a judge anyway, looking at this objectively, that the Supreme Court was kind of coming into this with their hands tied behind their back. They didn't have any of the power of the other branches of government. So what happens? A few years after that, about 15 years later, in 1803, there is a Chief Justice by the name of Marshall, who comes along, who decides for the first time, what will the Supreme Court of the United States do? What kind of power will the Supreme Court have? And this was something that has now been known as judicial review. It was not something that you find in the four corners of the Constitution, but you find the clear intent in the Constitution that there be a balanced system with the judiciary, the Congress, and the executive, the president. It also established for all time that there would be checks and balances, that the Supreme Court would be the check on the legislature, on the Congress, and also on the executive branch. And I don't think anybody can argue that there has been a tremendous amount of impact over the years by decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court. Go back to Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, where they made a decision that separate and equal was okay, that allowed for the separate facilities of African Americans and white Americans for the next 50 years. It wasn't until 1954, when they had the case of Brown versus Board of Education, that they said, it's time now, it's time that this is not equal, that separate and equal has not achieved what we believe we should achieve under our Constitution. The interesting thing at that point in time was, as I mentioned, the Supreme Court doesn't have an army, doesn't have a militia, doesn't have a law enforcement agency. It took 3 years for some states to actually comply with that law. It took intervention by federal troops at the command of the executive officer of this country. But in any event, it moved us forward in our society. All right, let's skip fast forward. Bush versus Gore, 2000. Does anybody think that the U.S. Supreme Court didn't have a huge impact on our country at that point in time? It doesn't matter what side of this you're on. It doesn't matter. The point is, there's a huge impact that was brought to this country. Everybody waited and watched to see what the U.S. Supreme Court was going to do. We're now in 2012. Was there anybody that wasn't paying attention to what the U.S. Supreme Court was going to do in the Patient Affordable Health Care Act? Nobody knew what was going to happen, but it happened. It had its impact, and we were concerned about it. And in fact, one U.S. senator said, just because a couple of people on the Supreme Court declare something to be constitutional doesn't make it so. The whole thing remains unconstitutional. Well, I think that's wrong. I think that the Supreme Court making a decision is the final arbiter. We've agreed to that concept for 209 years, but there's no one in any place in this country who seriously can argue that the Supreme Court doesn't have the last say on constitutionality. It doesn't mean that it's a good decision, it's the right decision, it's the right legislation, it's for our time, it's going to change everything for the good, it's going to change everything for the bad. In fact, they even quoted Chief Justice Roberts as saying, his explanation for the vote to affirm the new law, saying the Supreme Court, and this is out of the opinion, the Supreme Court is not here to save the American people from the decisions of the government it elects. If you want a different decision, elect a different government.